The golden hues of sunset faded into deep shades of purple as the last light disappeared behind the rooftops of Oakbrook. The quiet neighborhood settled into its usual calm, unaware that something unusual was about to happen. Rusty, a golden retriever with a coat that showed years of wisdom, walked silently along the sidewalk. His paws pressed softly against the cold pavement, and his nose twitched at the scents carried by the gentle evening breeze. Rusty was well loved by the neighbors, even though he didn't have a home to call his own anymore. He wandered the streets freely, always greeted with kindness by those who crossed his path. As Rusty turned onto Maple Street, the familiar sight of Mrs. Abney's porch came into view. The elderly widow always left out a bowl of kibble for him. She was sitting outside, her soft smile lighting up the dimming evening. "There you are, you old charmer," she said warmly, leaning forward to pet Rusty. Her thin hand stroked his weathered fur as he wagged his tail in response. "Stay safe tonight, Rusty. Something feels different in the air." Rusty gave her hand a gentle nudge before moving on. The quiet of the night surrounded him as he continued his walk. But just as he reached the end of the street, a strange sound broke through the silence. A faint, high-pitched cry echoed from somewhere nearby. Rusty froze, his ears swiveling to catch the sound. It wasn't like anything he had heard before. His curiosity piqued. Rusty followed the noise, each step bringing him closer to its source. What could it be? Rusty followed the faint cry, his steps quickening as the sound became clearer. His nose twitched, guiding him through the empty streets of Oakbrook and into the dimly lit community park. The familiar playground stood eerily silent, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. But the cry was unmistakable now, closer, louder, and more urgent. Rusty padded toward the row of trash bins lined up near the edge of the park. The cry tugged at him, stirring a protective instinct buried deep within his loyal heart. His sharp senses guided him to the last trash can. Rusty rose on his hind legs, sniffing furiously, his paws leaning against the cold metal. And then he saw it. Amidst the crumpled papers and broken bits of plastic lay a small bundle. The sound of crying grew softer as Rusty gently nudged the edge of the blanket with his nose. His heart raced. Beneath the folds of the fabric was a baby, a tiny, helpless infant. For a moment, Rusty stood frozen, his brown eyes fixed on the fragile form. The baby's tiny fists waved weakly, its face red from crying. Rusty seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Carefully, with unmatched gentleness, he gripped the edge of the blanket with his teeth and lifted the baby from the trash. The cries softened as the baby nestled against Rusty's warm fur. He could feel the little one's shallow breaths against him, and an unfamiliar urgency surged through him. Without hesitation, Rusty began trotting back toward the neighborhood, his steps purposeful and swift. The streets were quiet, but Rusty knew where he had to go. Margaret Thorne's house came to mind. Margaret, a retired nurse who had a kind heart for animals and people alike, lived just a few blocks away. Rusty had always felt safe near her. If anyone could help, it was her. As Rusty moved through the empty streets, headlights suddenly lit up the road ahead. A teenage boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop, his eyes widening in shock. "Whoa! Is that a dog carrying a baby?" the boy exclaimed, fumbling to pull out his phone. Rusty didn't stop. His determination was unwavering, and he pressed on toward Margaret's house. The baby's cries had grown faint now, and Rusty knew there wasn't a moment to lose. Rusty reached Margaret Thorne's house, his paws brushing against the welcome mat as he placed the baby down with incredible care. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. Inside, Margaret sat in her armchair, a warm blanket draped over her legs as she flipped through an old novel. The bark startled her, pulling her attention toward the door. Her brows furrowed. She recognized that bark. It was Rusty's. But something about it carried a note of urgency she had never heard before. Margaret set her book aside and hurried to the door. As she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. There on the porch lay the tiny bundle. The baby's cries were faint now, its face red and scrunched as it struggled against the cold night air. Rusty stood over the infant, his gaze shifting between Margaret and the baby, as if urging her to act. "Oh my heavens," Margaret gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Without hesitation, she knelt and scooped the baby into her arms, cradling the fragile form against her. Rusty whined softly, nudging Margaret's arm with his nose. Rusty, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. Where, where did you find this child? The dog let out a low whimper, his eyes never leaving the baby. Margaret didn't need an answer. The urgency in Rusty's actions told her everything she needed to know. This baby needed help, and fast. Her hands worked automatically, the years of nursing training kicking in. The baby's skin was cool to the touch, its tiny body trembling. Margaret quickly wrapped her shawl around the infant, trying to provide warmth. She grabbed her phone with her free hand and dialed 911, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This is Margaret Thorne, 1542 Sycamore Street. I have a newborn infant here, possibly suffering from hypothermia. Please send an ambulance immediately." Rusty sat beside her, his gaze unwavering as he watched Margaret cradle the baby. She glanced down at him, her eyes softening. "You did something amazing tonight, Rusty," she murmured. "You saved this child's life." Moments later, the distant wail of sirens broke through the quiet night. The sound grew louder as the ambulance approached, its flashing lights illuminating Margaret's porch. Two paramedics rushed out, their expressions shifting to shock as they took in the scene. "Is that a dog?" one of them asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And he's the reason this baby is alive." The paramedics worked quickly, checking the baby's vitals and wrapping it in a thermal blanket. Margaret hesitated, then asked, "May I come along?" "I'm a retired nurse. I can help." The paramedics exchanged a glance before nodding. Margaret turned to Rusty. "You're coming too, aren't you, boy?" Rusty wagged his tail softly, his eyes bright with determination. The ambulance sped through the quiet streets, its sirens piercing the night. Margaret sat cradling the baby in her arms, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Rusty lay beside her on the floor of the ambulance, his warm brown eyes fixed on the child, as if silently promising to protect it. Margaret glanced at the paramedic sitting across from her. "How is she?" she asked, her voice low but steady. The paramedic nodded reassuringly. "Her vitals are weak, but she's holding on. Getting her to the hospital was the right move." Rusty let out a soft whine, his ears twitching at the sound of the baby's faint cries. Margaret reached down to stroke his fur. "You did good, boy," she whispered. "Better than good." When they arrived at Chicago Memorial Hospital, the emergency room doors flew open. Doctors and nurses hurried toward the ambulance, their expressions shifting from professional focus to astonishment when they spotted Rusty. "Is that a dog?" one of the nurses asked, her eyes wide. Margaret stepped out of the ambulance, clutching the baby tightly. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, "and he's the reason this baby is alive." The staff exchanged curious glances, but wasted no time whisking the baby away to the NICU. Margaret hesitated for a moment, watching as the tiny infant disappeared through the swinging doors. A lump formed in her throat. She had only just met this child, but the thought of being separated filled her with an ache she couldn't explain. Rusty nudged her leg, grounding her. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him. "We'll wait right here, boy," she said softly. "She's in good hands now." The minutes stretched into an hour as Margaret and Rusty sat in the waiting area. The hospital was quiet, the hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses the only sounds. Rusty lay at Margaret's feet, his body still but his eyes alert, watching every movement around them. Finally, the NICU doors opened, and Dr. Liam Reeves, an old colleague of Margaret's, stepped out. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes held a glimmer of hope. "Margaret," he said, his tone gentle, "the baby is stable for now, but she has a rare heart condition, tetralogy of Fallot. She'll need surgery to survive." Margaret's heart clenched. "Is she strong enough?" Dr. Reeves nodded. "It's going to be a challenge, but I'll be performing the surgery myself. She's a fighter, Margaret, and she has you and—" His gaze dropped to Rusty, a small smile tugging at his lips. "And this incredible dog by her side." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of clicking heels broke the quiet. A woman in a crisp suit approached, her expression stern. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Geraldine Hawkins with Animal Control. I've received a report about a stray dog in the hospital." Margaret stiffened, instinctively placing a protective hand on Rusty's collar. "Rusty isn't just any stray," she said firmly. "He saved a baby's life tonight. He has every right to be here. Hawkins raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. Rules are rules, ma'am. Stray dogs, no matter how heroic, pose a health risk in a medical facility. Before Margaret could argue further, Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. Ms. Hawkins, this dog has done more for this hospital tonight than any rule book ever could. I'll personally vouch for him. He's staying. Hawkins hesitated, glancing around the waiting room. She noticed the nurses and staff watching, their faces filled with admiration for Rusty. With a sigh, she relented. Fine, she said curtly, but I'll be keeping an eye on him. As Hawkins walked away, Margaret knelt down and hugged Rusty tightly. You're safe with us, boy, she murmured. No one's taking you away. The hours passed slowly as Margaret and Rusty remained in the waiting area. Nurses and doctors stopped by occasionally, offering updates and warm smiles. Many paused to pet Rusty, some slipping him treats, others simply thanking him for his bravery. Finally, as dawn broke over the city, a nurse emerged from the NICU. She smiled at Margaret, her eyes filled with warmth. The baby made it through the night, she said softly. She's a fighter, just like you said. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She looked down at Rusty, his tail thumping softly against the floor. We're not done yet, boy, she whispered. She still needs us. As the first light of dawn spilled through the hospital windows, Margaret found herself standing outside the NICU. Her fingers pressed gently against the glass, watching the tiny baby nestled in her incubator. Despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her, the infant's small chest rose and fell steadily, a fragile but determined rhythm of life. Rusty sat faithfully at Margaret's side, his brown eyes fixed on the baby, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Margaret placed a hand on his head, her voice barely above a whisper. She needs a name, boy, something that fits her strength. Just then a nurse approached, her smile warm but her eyes thoughtful. We've been calling her Hope, the nurse said softly. It's just temporary until her family is found. But it feels right, doesn't it? Margaret repeated the name quietly, letting it settle in her heart. Hope, she murmured. It does feel right. Rusty gave a soft whine, nuzzling Margaret's leg as if to agree. Margaret smiled, crouching down to stroke his fur. You found her, Rusty, she said, her voice full of emotion, and now she has a chance because of you. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Detective May Chun, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before her. Good morning, Mrs. Thorne, she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. I've got some updates for you. Margaret rose to her feet, her heart skipping a beat. What is it, Detective? Did you find the parents? Detective Chun nodded, pulling out a small notebook. We've identified a young couple seen near the park where the baby was found. They admitted to abandoning her but claim they're not her biological parents. According to them, they found the baby themselves but panicked and left her there. Margaret's stomach turned at the thought. So they just left her? Like she was nothing? Chun's expression softened. It's hard to understand, but desperation makes people do terrible things. We're still investigating to see if there's any connection to her real family. Margaret glanced back at the baby, her heart aching with the weight of uncertainty. And if you don't find anyone? Chun hesitated, her gaze thoughtful. If no family comes forward, the baby will become a ward of the state. But she paused, her tone shifting to something gentler. You've been here for her every day, Margaret. It's clear how much you care. Have you thought about fostering her yourself? The question took Margaret by surprise. She looked down at Rusty, who tilted his head as if he were waiting for her answer. Me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Could I really do that? Chun smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. You're already doing it. The love you've shown her, it's more than most children ever get. You'd be perfect. Margaret's mind raced. The thought of becoming Hope's guardian filled her with equal parts joy and fear. She looked back at the tiny baby, her fragile form so full of potential. Could she really take on such a responsibility? Rusty let out a soft bark, breaking her thoughts. She knelt down to him, her eyes meeting his. What do you think, boy? Should we give her a home? His wagging tail was all the encouragement she needed. Later that day, Margaret found herself in Dr. Liam Reeves's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she shared her decision. "I want to foster Hope," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I want to give her a home." Dr. Reeves leaned back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. "Margaret, I can't think of anyone better. But you know this won't be easy. Hope's health challenges will require a lot of care and attention." Margaret nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I know, Liam, but she deserves a chance. And Rusty and we're ready to give her everything we have." Dr. Reeves reached across the desk, his hand resting gently on hers. "Then I'll support you every step of the way." The following week was a whirlwind of paperwork, home inspections, and preparations. Margaret transformed her small cottage into a haven for Hope, turning her spare room into a cozy nursery. Soft blankets lined the crib, and a mobile chimed gently in the morning light. Rusty followed Margaret everywhere, his watchful eyes and wagging tail a constant reminder that she wasn't doing this alone. Finally, the day came to bring Hope home. The hospital staff gathered to say their goodbyes, each nurse and doctor offering their best wishes and small gifts for the baby. Margaret held Hope close, her heart brimming with gratitude for the love this tiny girl had already inspired. Dr. Reeves gave Margaret a warm hug as they prepared to leave. "Take care of her, Margaret," he said softly. "And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all here to help." As Margaret stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Rusty trotted faithfully beside her. She carefully placed Hope in the car seat, watching as Rusty sat beside her, his head resting protectively near the baby. The drive home was quiet, filled with a profound sense of peace. Margaret glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling at the sight of Rusty and Hope together. For the first time in years, she felt like her life had a new purpose, a reason to move forward. When they arrived at the cottage, Margaret carried Hope inside, Rusty close on her heels. She settled the baby into her crib, watching as her tiny fingers curled around the edge of a soft blanket. Rusty patted over, his head tilted as he peered into the crib. Margaret smiled, placing a hand on his head. "She's part of our family now, Rusty," she whispered, "and we're going to take care of her, just like you did." Hope let out a soft coo, her tiny face peaceful as she drifted off to sleep. Margaret and Rusty sat together by the crib, their hearts full as they watched over her. The days that followed were filled with adjustments, challenges, and tiny victories. Hope's presence brought life back into Margaret's quiet cottage, her gentle coos and occasional cries becoming the soundtrack of their days. Rusty, ever faithful, shadowed Margaret everywhere she went, his eyes always watchful over the baby who had captured all their hearts. But the challenges were undeniable. Hope's medical needs demanded constant vigilance. Margaret found herself studying every detail of her condition, learning the intricacies of her care with the same dedication she had once given to her career as a NICU nurse. Late-night feedings blended into early morning doctor visits, and the weight of responsibility bore heavily on Margaret's shoulders. One rainy morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her head resting in her hands as tears of exhaustion slipped down her cheeks. Hope had barely slept the night before, and Margaret was beginning to feel the strain of balancing her care and her own well-being. Rusty patted over to her, his soft whimper breaking her out of her thoughts. She looked down at him, his soulful brown eyes full of understanding. He nudged her hand with his nose, and Margaret couldn't help but smile through her tears. "You always know when I need a pick-me-up, don't you, boy?" she said, scratching behind his ears. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen to see Dr. Liam Reeves's name. "Margaret, I just wanted to check in." His voice came through the line, warm and steady. "How's Hope doing?" "And how are you doing?" Margaret sighed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Hope is doing well. She's stronger every day, but it's a lot, Liam." Dr. Reeves's tone softened. "You're not alone in this, Margaret. Remember, you have a community behind you. And Rusty, of course," he added with a chuckle. Margaret glanced at Rusty, who was now lying at her feet, his tail wagging slightly as he watched her. "Rusty's my rock," she said, her voice steadying. "I don't know what I'd do without him." The support from her community was a lifeline. Neighbors stopped by with meals and supplies, offering words of encouragement and warm smiles. Even Detective Mei Chun visited regularly. Her sharp demeanor softened as she brought updates on the investigation into Hope's origins. One afternoon, as Margaret sat by Hope's crib, Detective Chun arrived with a thoughtful look on her face. "Margaret, we've uncovered a new lead," she began. "The young couple who abandoned Hope? They're not her biological parents. They found her, but were too scared to come forward. We're still trying to trace her true family." Margaret's heart ached at the news, the uncertainty of Hope's past weighing heavily on her. "So there's still no one for her?" she asked softly, her hand resting on Rusty's head. Detective Chun hesitated before replying. "Not yet, but that doesn't mean she's alone. She has you, Margaret, and from what I've seen, she couldn't be in better hands." Margaret glanced down at Rusty, who seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation. His warm gaze met hers, and she felt a surge of determination. "She'll never be alone," Margaret said firmly. "Not while we're here." The weeks turned into months, and Hope continued to grow stronger under Margaret's care. Her laughter filled the cottage, a sound so pure and joyful it brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Rusty remained her constant companion, his loyalty unwavering as he watched over the baby with quiet devotion. One sunny afternoon, Margaret decided it was time for a change of scenery. She bundled Hope into her stroller and clipped a leash onto Rusty's collar. Together, the three of them set out for Oak Brook's Community Park, the very place where Rusty had found Hope that fateful night. As they walked along the winding paths, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Hope gurgled happily in her stroller, her tiny hands reaching out to grab at the sunlight filtering through the trees. Rusty trotted beside them, his tail wagging as he took in the familiar sights and scents. They found a quiet spot beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches offering shade from the afternoon sun. Margaret spread out a blanket, settling Hope on the soft fabric as Rusty lay down beside her. She watched as Hope reached out to touch Rusty's fur, her tiny fingers curling around a strand of his golden coat. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love for the little family they had become. "You're her guardian, Rusty," she said softly, "and I couldn't ask for a better one." Just as she spoke, a voice called out from behind them. "Margaret!" She turned to see Dr. Reeves approaching, a broad smile on his face. "I was hoping I'd find you here," he said, glancing down at Hope with a twinkle in his eye. "She's looking stronger every day." Margaret beamed, pride evident in her expression. "She's a fighter, Liam, just like Rusty." Dr. Reeves knelt down to pet Rusty, his voice warm. "You're quite the hero, aren't you, old boy?" Rusty's tail thumped against the ground, his eyes shining with contentment. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret, Hope, and Rusty stayed beneath the oak tree, the sun casting golden light across the park. For the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret felt a sense of wholeness, a belief that they had found their place in the world. The challenges weren't over, but Margaret knew they were stronger together. Every day brought new hurdles, but it also brought new moments of joy. Rusty's presence was a constant reminder of the power of love and loyalty, and Margaret found herself drawing strength from him in ways she never expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat on the porch with Hope in her lap and Rusty at her feet. The air was warm and still, the only sound the gentle hum of cicadas in the distance. Margaret looked down at Rusty, her voice soft. "You changed everything, you know. You brought her to me when I didn't even know I needed her. And now," she trailed off, her eyes misting with tears. Rusty lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers with quiet understanding. Margaret smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "We're a family now, and no matter what happens, we'll face it together." The crisp autumn air carried a sense of renewal as Margaret, Rusty, and Hope settled into their rhythm as a family. Their days were filled with laughter and moments of quiet togetherness. Despite the challenges, their bond only grew stronger with time. One bright morning, Margaret received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from the Oak Brook City Council, and her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter informed her that Rusty had been officially recognized as a local hero for his incredible act of courage and compassion. A ceremony was to be held in his honor at the very park where he had first found Hope. Margaret knelt down beside Rusty, showing him the letter as if he could read it. "Do you hear that, boy? They want to honor you," she said with a smile. her voice filled with pride. Rusty wagged his tail, his warm brown eyes meeting hers as if he understood. On the day of the ceremony, the entire community gathered at Oakbrook Park. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came to celebrate the heroic dog who had saved a life and brought hope to so many. Margaret held Hope close as they walked to the stage, Rusty trotting faithfully beside them. The mayor stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd. Today, we honor a true hero, a dog whose courage and instinct remind us all of the power of kindness and loyalty. Rusty's actions that night didn't just save a life, they united a community. The crowd erupted in applause as Margaret knelt beside Rusty, placing a golden medal around his neck. Engraved on the medal were the words, Oakbrook's Guardian, a true hero. Rusty wagged his tail, his gaze scanning the crowd as if he understood the significance of the moment. Margaret's heart swelled with pride as she whispered, "You've always been a hero to me, Rusty." As the ceremony continued, children came forward to pet Rusty, their laughter filling the air. Hope gurgled happily in Margaret's arms, her tiny fingers reaching out toward the dog who had saved her life. Margaret smiled, knowing this was a day they would all cherish forever. The days that followed were filled with warmth and gratitude. Margaret received countless letters from people inspired by Rusty's story. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her and Rusty for their courage. Hope's story became a symbol of resilience and love, and Margaret felt a profound sense of purpose as she navigated their new life together. But amidst the joy, there were still challenges. Hope's health required constant care, and Margaret often found herself exhausted by the demands of being a single mother to a child with special needs. Rusty, however, was always by her side, his quiet strength a source of comfort. One night, as Margaret sat by the fireplace with Hope in her arms, she looked down at Rusty, who lay at her feet. "You've done so much for us, Rusty," she said softly. "I don't know how I could ever repay you." Rusty lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers with an expression that seemed to say, "You already have." Months turned into years, and Hope grew stronger with each passing day. Her laughter filled the cottage, and her bond with Rusty deepened in ways Margaret hadn't thought possible. Wherever Hope went, Rusty was close behind, his protective presence a constant reminder of the night he had found her. As Hope took her first steps, Rusty was there, his tail wagging as he watched her wobble across the room. Margaret clapped her hands, her heart brimming with pride as she scooped Hope into her arms. "You're such a brave girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Rusty barked softly as if echoing Margaret's sentiment. One crisp winter morning, as snow blanketed the ground outside, Margaret received another unexpected visitor. Detective May Chun stood on her porch holding a small envelope. "Margaret," she began, her tone serious yet kind, "we found something." Margaret's heart raced as she took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a letter, written in hurried, uneven handwriting. "To whomever finds her, please take care of my daughter. I can't give her the life she deserves, but I hope someone will love her as much as I do." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. Rusty sat at her feet, his gaze steady as he seemed to sense the weight of the moment. "She was loved," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Even before she found us, she was loved." Detective Chun placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You've given her everything her mother wanted for her. Hope couldn't have asked for a better family." As the seasons changed, so did their little family. Hope grew into a curious and vibrant child, her laughter echoing through the cottage as she played with Rusty in the yard. Margaret often found herself watching them, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. Rusty, though older now, remained a steadfast presence in their lives. His steps were slower, and his naps were longer, but his spirit was as strong as ever. One sunny afternoon, Margaret sat on the porch with Hope and Rusty by her side. She looked out at the yard, where flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, a symbol of the life they had built together. "We've come so far, haven't we?" she said, her voice filled with wonder. Rusty wagged his tail, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet understanding. That night, as Margaret tucked Hope into bed, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She kissed Hope's forehead, whispering, "You're our little miracle." Rusty lay at the foot of the bed, his watchful eyes never leaving Hope as she drifted off to sleep. Margaret sat beside him, stroking his fur as tears filled her eyes. "You've given us everything, Rusty," she said softly, "and we'll never forget it." Rusty closed his eyes, his body relaxed as he let out a contented sigh. In that moment, Margaret knew they were exactly where they were meant to be, together as a family. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as Margaret sat in the quiet of the night, with Rusty by her side and Hope sleeping soundly, she felt an unshakable sense of hope for the future. The past had brought them together, and the love they shared would carry them forward.